Welcome to this pre-recorded webinar, which forms part of the Student Skills and Professional Development Workstream for the University of Glasgow. In September 2024, colleagues and students from across the university will be gathering in two workshops to co-create a shared language of transferable skills. This webinar provides the context for those workshops, and the webinar is entitled From Value to Impact: Conversations about Curriculum and Transferable Skills at the University of Glasgow. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Kate Daubeny, and I've been invited by Professor Stephanie Biello and Sarah Armour, the co-leads of the Skills Workstream, to facilitate the creation of this shared language of transferable skills. I'm a former academic, a film musicologist, and I started my career in higher education over 30 years ago at the University of Derby and then at the University of Leeds. I've published research in film music and in jazz, and I edited a long-standing series of books on film musicology up until 2017. I'm also qualified in teaching and learning in higher education and in digital education, and I'm a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. In the early 2000s, I moved into careers and employability education, and in 2008 I became the PhD and postdoc advisor at the London School of Economics, and later a careers consultant at Imperial Business School. I went on to run the careers services at the University of Chester and at King's College London, and after that I took up directorship of the Careers Group Federation of University Careers Services for the University of London Federation. I now work as a freelance consultant with universities, schools and other education and student-to-graduate organisations around the world. Much of my work is advising on skills and curriculum, on education strategy and on careers and employability strategies. I'm a board member for Careers Wales, the all-age careers service for Wales, and an advisor to Practera, a global experiential learning provider. I also created SkillsMap, which is a free-to-use platform where learners can find out about some of the transferable skills they develop in 36 different academic subjects. I've also published on my peer-reviewed research on transferable skills and curriculum, and I'll provide some links at the end of the webinar. As many of you will be aware, there are 4 work streams in the learning and teaching strategy: assessment and feedback, transforming curricula, student skills and professional development, and evolving teaching practice. The student skills and professional development workstream involves identifying opportunities and appetite for skills-based courses, models and approach to such provision, greater embedding of skills within the curriculum, a coherent framework and approach to promoting student engagement with skills development, and the graduate attributes framework. What I will be exploring in this webinar, and which we will consider in practice in the 2 workshops in September 2024, is one particular approach to the relationship between skills and curriculum that reframes what we might mean when we say embedding in relation to skills. This approach is something I developed in 2017 when I was head of careers and employability at King's College London and leading the design and implementation of a whole of university conversation about employability. As an approach to this conversation, it's gained quite a bit of traction with universities across the UK and internationally, not least because it also addresses an important conversation that we need to have about the value we want students to gain from a degree. And I've been advising universities on how they might adapt this approach for their students and their context since then. It therefore contributes to the conversation about student engagement with skill development, and it also integrates work already done on using a graduate attributes framework at Glasgow. We can see the work on curriculum transformation at Glasgow as essentially a conversation about many facets of education. In my experience of working in and with a great diversity of universities, I think academics, professional service colleagues, third space colleagues and students are all in very similar places when it comes to thinking about education, because we share a common sense that we want the education we provide to have an enduring value to students, and we're keen to have a conversation about how that happens. But if we change the question to asking who wants a conversation about employability, not so many people might show up. Careers and employability colleagues might be more interested than academic colleagues, and other professional services colleagues might not feel a very strong connection to that outcome of the degree. We can imagine that many students would also want to know about that, if indeed they know what the word employability actually means, which we can't take for granted that they do. In fact, this is an experience I had first-hand at King's College London when I arrived to start the project, which was initially being scoped as being to embed employability in curriculum. While the King's project did not have the strategic context that the Glasgow project has, it was intended to be a cross-institutional approach that was tied into a change to quality assurance processes, programme development and programme review. When I started to talk to academic colleagues across King's about embedding employability in curriculum, this is some of the things that they said. Employability is not academically rigorous content. There isn't enough time in the syllabus to do extra stuff. This is not relevant to my students. It doesn't belong in the academic space. Students are here to escape the world, not prepare for it. It's dangerous and sinister. Teaching employability is not my job. The challenge we have, however, is that the conversation is still very live and heated about what we mean by value in higher education, despite a change in government in Westminster. And when we measure value in terms of employment outcomes, it seems unavoidable that we would end up having a conversation about employability in education. After all, to the uninitiated outsider, employability and employment are the same thing, aren't they? I'm hopeful that many of you realise that they aren't, and we'll look at why they aren't shortly. So I propose that a more useful question that builds consensus in a conversation about education and value might be something like, what do we want to be different for students as a result of an education? I think broadly speaking, everyone with a genuine stake in this conversation, students, academic colleagues, teaching and learning professionals, careers and employability professionals, and employers, can agree on the answer, which is that students love their degree and they can articulate and realise its value in the longer term. Where we might start to see things differently is in how we describe that value. Students might say, I enjoyed it and it got me a job. Academics might say, a rigorous and deep understanding of the subject. Teaching and learning colleagues might say, effective, independent, lifelong learning skills. Careers and employability professionals might say an understanding of the choices open to students and how to use their education to achieve their goals. And employers might say, we got a skilled, capable graduate. But these definitions of value don't entirely align with each other. The factual reality, particularly in a pretty healthy graduate recruitment market like the UK, is that our graduates are highly employable. But when we look at the overlap of the definitions of three of those stakeholders, students, careers professionals and employers, it would be easy to think that education is excluded or somehow irrelevant to the transition through university. That's particularly the case if we assume that employed graduates have and are automatically aware of their employability. And if we also appear to reduce the transition through university to a conversation about producing skilled and employable graduates and not educated ones. As a former academic and as a senior careers and employability leader when I was at King's, That apparent exclusion of education from the transition from being a student to being employed fundamentally concerned me. So I wanted to reshape the conversation about employability and curriculum as a way of making sense of that transition without excluding education. A good example of the transition from being a student to being employed is that not only is the UK graduate recruitment market fairly healthy, but it also has a relatively unusual feature which isn't seen as much in other countries, that a significant majority of employers are subject agnostic. That means that they have no particular preference from graduates from a particular degree subject. This is great for inclusion and for enabling more diverse career exploration. A great example of this is that a few years ago, one of the big four professional services firms recruited more history graduates to become tax auditors than from any other subject, not from accountancy or business or not from maths, but they came from history. Now, the employer definitely wasn't looking for the knowledge that those students have, but they were looking for some key transferable skills and attributes that are innate to being both a historian and a tax auditor. We could, of course, say that that's what made those history graduates employable as tax auditors. But they could have applied those skills and attributes to many different contexts and not just to work. And I think that means that we can call it value because that's what those skills and attributes are. The enduring value of the degree that the student will build and grow and apply and evolve throughout their lives in many contexts. So that's history, but what does that value look like in other subjects? And why have we not done this before? The key to this lies in how we talk about education, curriculum, and qualifications. Most curriculum focuses heavily on knowledge, the acquisition of it, and the testing of that acquisition. But when we review core curriculum documentation, as I did when I read every single Quality Assurance Agency subject benchmark statement at the start of this project in 2017, we find really rich references to attributes, transferable skills, and experience, which is all great except that students don't know that that's what they're developing alongside their subject knowledge. In fact, if you read the newer benchmark statements, you'll see that there's a shift now towards a more standardized approach to talking about skills in particular. But I'm pretty sure that students still don't read those documents, even if the QAA aspires for them to do so. So in developing this approach to thinking about employability and curriculum, I used that framework of understanding curriculum as knowledge, attributes, skills, and experience to create a way of surfacing and articulating all that value to students. I called this extracted employability because in a literal sense this process is a way of extracting the elements of curriculum that contribute to a student's employability. But I think it's also crucially a model for academics to reconsider their existing academically rigorous curriculum without changing it, but by using this more nuanced lens of case, knowledge, attributes, skills, and experience. It integrates all the different definitions of value that the stakeholders in this conversation have. And it also very usefully helps us understand how students can navigate our subject-agnostic graduate recruitment market. In other words, why historians become great tax auditors too. Knowledge gain is always a given in curriculum design and learning outcomes. But the development of those rich and diverse attributes and transferable skills, not to mention experience, that are innate to the subject is often a more contentious kind of learning gain because of that seemingly transactional nature of education into employment. And if we don't tell students it's happening, then it's much more difficult for them to be aware of too. And just to be clear about definitions here, I use the term attributes to mean qualities and mindsets of personality, both innate and acquired, while skills are transferable and specialist capabilities that are developed. Before we go on, I want briefly to connect this way of thinking about employability and curriculum with other work that's going on in this and other pillars in the Glasgow strategy. Extracted employability proposes that we can surface and articulate to students the knowledge, attributes, skills and experience that are already present in curriculum. But if you also run placements or credit-bearing internships, if there's employer input to curriculum, or you do interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary projects or applied dissertations or any other kind of experiential learning in curriculum, then you're also adding employability to curriculum. And this is the enhance element of the Glasgow Embedding Employability strategy. But I think it's worth us also recognising that there's a social justice factor behind choosing to apply both of these approaches in tandem. Because added employability is often the optional stuff, the content that students can elect to take if it's not compulsory. And the risk there is that you end up only attracting the students who already know it's valuable, or those students who don't have barriers to taking part, whether personal or contextual. But if universities are really to fulfill their social justice potential and responsibility, then they must find a way to ensure that all students recognise that they are developing their employability through curriculum, no matter how that curriculum is shaped, no matter whether they have the opportunity to do credit-bearing placements, for example, or not, and no matter what subject they study. We must make it structurally unavoidable for all students to develop their employability, not just behind the scenes without an awareness of it, but with a fully developed sense of their own employability development. I believe that extracted employability is the most secure way that we can do that, because we're saying to every student, no matter what you study, you are developing your employability. Now, I want to just pause for a moment to reflect on what this means for academics. As an academic myself, and also as someone whose professional practice is often focused on helping academics and researchers explore their professional identity and career direction, I know that conversations about value can quickly take on an existential and quite personal quality. We're talking about our identities here. And when we think about employability as a subset of that value, we can feel that this conversation quickly becomes reductive. And certainly that has been some of the background noise in the sector for a while, that our personal and professional identities are under threat from the direction of travel in the sector, and that employability is part of that. But what I'm proposing is that when we think about identifying and articulating the innate employability value of curriculum, we're not only thinking about the ends for which it is used, employment, but we're also celebrating our subjects with students and helping them get a much better understanding of the long-term value of their degree, whatever form their lives take. We want to feel that we are shaping our students' lives, and we are doing so, but far beyond giving them a passion for learning or a fascination for key concepts or ideas. We're celebrating the enduring, innate value of our subjects, and I think that directly connects with our identity. I also think that's entirely compatible with academic rigour and curriculum integrity. And it's all about getting more impact from what we already do. When we extract employability from curriculum, we aren't teaching any differently, but we are talking differently about what we teach and perhaps who we are. So, having thought briefly about academics and our identity, let's think a bit more about our students and who they are and where they are. Of course, we know that they want more out of university than just getting a good job. We want them to love their subject and enjoy studying. And of course, we know that some of them will love it so much that they will carry on studying. But there are some other reasons why I think it's important to help them understand their degree through this lens of value, the knowledge, attributes, skills and experience they innately develop through curriculum. Firstly, that subject agnostic graduate recruitment market in the UK is important. While I know that many of your students won't stay to work in the UK, even if that's their aspiration, it is a feature of how they will hear employers talk about who and what they're looking for. Whether employers are looking for knowledge or not, they're definitely looking for those transferable skills and attributes, and they will develop and assess the performance of those employees through that lens. I think this way of thinking about entry to employment markets is also important for students who won't be able to access their first choice of career for some reason. It helps them recognise that they have much to offer a diverse range of employers, and that keeps their options open. Next, we can't ignore the unpredictability of the future of work. These are chaotic and difficult times globally and nationally, and even though our graduate market is fairly stable at the moment, that will not always be the case. PwC's recent Hopes and Fears survey, which is a compelling and terrifying read every year, highlighted these fascinating statistics. That 44% of those surveyed didn't understand why things had to change, 62% experienced more change in the last year than the year before, 47% were concerned about job security, 51% thought that the skills their job required would change in the next 5 years, and fewer than half thought that their employer provided adequate opportunities to learn new skills to support their career. The working world is changing at a faster pace than ever, and our graduates need to be ready to enter that world and thrive in it, not just survive. I'm not going to go into AI now, we haven't got all day, but I highly recommend the Harvard Business School and BCG report on centaurs and cyborgs for some practical research and analysis. All of that means that we need to support students into diverse outcomes, including those which are not aligned to their degree subjects now or in the future, so that we can enable them to have long-term career agility, whatever comes and whatever choices they make about their working lives. Barely 5 years ago, we were suggesting that graduates would have 10 or more different roles in their lifetimes. Now they're likely to start their career in more than one role, with side hustles and volunteering, greater curiosity about what their lives might look like, and a greater reluctance to make choices that harm their well-being or the planet. Their working futures are unimaginable, so we need to give them as much help as we can to gain the tools they need to change and shape their career pathways and feel confident of the value they bring to work, whatever work is meaningful to them. Which leads nicely to what is in so many ways the best reason for talking about the enduring value of curriculum in this way, which is that it includes every single student. As I mentioned a moment ago, curriculum is the one structurally unavoidable and inclusive place where we meet students where they are. No student is left out. Every student develops this value and they can use it to help them be employable. So that's the journey that I went on to develop extracted employability and to try to reframe the conversation about what employability is and what the value of education is. I want to spend the next few minutes thinking about the opportunities and possibilities of working in this way. How do universities use this sort of approach in practice? Holistically, there is a conversation about strategy. At an institutional level, we can change the conversation about the value of a degree, or reshape our institutional understanding of employability. We can review all our programs to embed employability, and we can create a language of transferable skills that everyone, both academic and professional services, in our university can use, a language that works for students and employers too. All of these, in one way or another, tie into the priorities of the Student Skills and Professional Development pillar at Glasgow. These also trickle down or across into other strategic priorities at a local level, which also tie into other pillars of the learning and teaching strategy at Glasgow. For example, enriching the language of employability used in programs, or enriching the language of transferable skills used in teaching, learning, and assessment. Connecting with discussions about meaningful assessment and experiential learning, or reviewing skills awards to connect more effectively to academic work. When I developed this approach to articulating the employability value of curriculum at King's College London, we were coming at the conversation from the point of view of quality assurance processes and programme approval. So we redefined employability with a specific focus on the language of skills. To achieve that, I developed a taxonomy of over 200 transferable skills and over 80 attributes, all innately developed through curriculum, in order to provide a language for academics and students to recognise in their academically rigorous curriculum. What we did next at King's was to support academics to embed and apply this language in new programme design. And that then enabled academics to revisit their curriculum and consider the impacts on their teaching, learning and assessment, with particular emphasis on skills. But what about those skills? If you don't have a ready-made taxonomy, where do they come from? Well, the conversation usually starts in one of two places. Either with a high-level university graduate attributes framework of a few elements, or by generating a bespoke language of skills that comes from curriculum itself and is owned directly by academics. This is what the University of Glasgow currently uses as its institutional framework. From a taxonomy perspective, there's a mixture of skills and attributes here, sitting across academic, personal, and transferable dimensions. Extracted employability proposes that while different skills and attributes might emerge from different sources in curriculum and beyond it, they are all transferable to diverse work and other contexts. But if we want a more complex and nuanced language, or we want to do more complicated things with it, like using it to redefine our learning outcomes and assessment, we might want to create something that's a bit bigger. And that means finding a sweet spot between a holistic institutional graduate attributes framework and the possibilities of an incredibly detailed and academically meaningful language of skills that comes out of and is innate to the subjects themselves. Graduate attributes frameworks, often seen by university leadership as epitomising institutional identity. But for academics, a short list of, say, 8 to 10 elements can seem very reductive or somewhat simplistic. Furthermore, skills and attributes are sometimes seen as one and the same or interchangeable. And some academics can struggle to find a sufficient level of nuance or relevance in the elements of a graduate attributes framework that have been chosen. On the other hand, academically meaningful skills language is often highly context-specific by subject, and it can be really rich, surfacing a lot of skills, as we saw in the King's College London taxonomy I created. But we also need to ask ourselves, is the language of skills that emerges from maths recognisable in, say, history or design? And if it is quite nuanced and precise in an academic context, is it also recognisable to employers across diverse industries and sectors? However we go about this, this conversation echoes the disciplinary skills element of the Glasgow Embedding Employability Framework and the identify stage, to understand the employability value innate to the subject or discipline and what is developed naturally during course and programme design. So this is how we might create an academically meaningful skills language. We might start with any one of several different sources: a national or regulatory language of skills, our subject curriculum, or a generic non-academic source. We build a taxonomy out of this, categorizing and arranging transferable skills in different clusters to make a usable shared language. There's a strong sense of ownership by academic colleagues, but if every subject adds in its own language, then there is a risk of diverse and quite inconsistent language. It can, though, be curated into a structured, shared and common language. We can also get to a richer and more diverse language of transferable skills by building down from an existing graduate attributes framework. Underneath each of the identified elements, we create, through collaborative discussion, some examples or subcategories of each of those, and then departments can add on a further level of detail that feels relevant to their subject. And here is an example of what that might look like for an identified graduate framework element of problem solving. We're aiming to work down an axis of detail, as it were, adding more precision to the language to make it more relevant to more subjects. Firstly, we might identify some subcategories. I've suggested 3 examples here, but you might have 1 or 2 more. The language here at this level is mutually agreed by academics from different subject areas, but of course not all the subcategories might be used in different subjects. And then at the next level you might have some examples. I've suggested just 1 example here from Breaking Down Structures, which is frame the problem with parameters. But again, there might be a few more. Again, the language here is mutually agreed, and it also again might not be used in all subjects. But when we replicate this approach across a range of categories of skills or framework elements, we get a reasonably good representation of a comprehensive language of skills that is recognizable by and usable in diverse academic subjects. Next, we want to think about where those skills are going to be used. We can consider an axis of application in the academic context. And in physics, for example, we might add to frame the problem with parameters an added skill called define the problem with theoretical parameters. While in design, say, we might explore the requirements of this situation with user-defined expectations. But if the degree and these skills are to have value to the student beyond higher education, they need to be recognisable in an employment context too. So that language of design can be slightly adapted to say, explore the requirements of the situation from the user's point of view, and the language of physics can be slightly adapted to define the problem against industry standards, any industry standards. Subjects that don't develop problem-solving skills to quite this level of specificity might also find familiarity and a sufficient level of detail in saying break down problems instead of break down structures, and they could provide detail of the process of problem solving at a more holistic level. Key, however, must be the student's ability to recognise and apply the skill in both the academic and employment contexts. Which breaks down to 2 fairly simple questions the student needs to ask themselves. What do I understand this subject to be? And what is the longer term value to me of studying this subject? However we get to our language of skills, it needs to support the student to answer those questions. But wherever the language of skills comes from, it's completely meaningless to students if they aren't engaging with it pedagogically, and if they don't recognise it in their curriculum experience. And what I'm going to do next is to explain how that happens, which supports the surface phase of the Glasgow Embedding Employability Framework. From our point of view as educators, we can see this sort of strategic approach as a journey with stages. And the key is to think of this journey as one of dynamic engagement for yourselves as academic colleagues, but particularly for students, rather than assuming that it just sort of happens. If we don't point out any of this to students, then they don't know it's there, and we won't get as much impact from our teaching. I use a 5-stage model to describe how that happens. And I want to acknowledge that, slightly confusingly, the language I use is both similar and different to the 5 stages of the Glasgow Embedding Employability Framework. But my focus here is the impact for students of engagement with skills and attributes at each stage, rather than simply the process of how that happens. Firstly, your role as academics is to surface those transferable skills and attributes, to actually know what they are so that you can talk to students about them. Some of the work that I do with universities and with pre-18 schools and colleges as a consultant, and that I'll be doing with Glasgow in September 2024, is helping them develop that shared language or taxonomy of transferable skills to achieve precisely those outcomes, including working with whatever skills and attributes language is already in place. I mentioned at the start that I created my free skills map platform to start that conversation with learners in the pre-18 context. And as I discussed a few minutes ago, the challenge in creating a shared language of transferable skills and attributes is how detailed you want to be, and finding a sweet spot between a simple shortlist and an academically nuanced language. Some of the work I do includes helping build out from such a shortlist to provide every programme with language that is both meaningful to their programme and consistent across the faculty and institution. Another way of looking at that language is to think of the kinds of spaces in which we can see different subsets of skills emerging. We might come to the language of transferable skills by thinking about shared disciplinary skills and attributes, subject-specific skills and attributes, and then workplace-specific or subject-agnostic skills and attributes. And once you've surfaced that language, whatever form it takes, there are some interesting things that you can do with it. Once we've surfaced our language of transferable skills and attributes, we then need to make them recognisable to students. One way to do that is through a programme or subject framework that you use for marketing the programme externally and in high-level programme documentation. This is a case study from the MSc in Global Financial Analytics that we did quite early on at King's College London when I was rolling out extracted employability for new programmes. I don't think it's a commercial secret that while qualified graduates for the financial analytics sector are much in demand, it's in fact not an easy sector to get into, and it is highly competitive. Knowledge acquisition is therefore highly significant in marketing the degree to prospective students. But for international students who often dominate programmes like these, the job market in the UK can be very difficult to access. We recognise the need to change the conversation about the wider value of the degree to open up graduate outcome and career choices. And this is an extract from the case framework we built for this programme. The key takeaway here is how many places you can make this language recognisable to both prospective and current students, including external web pages and marketing materials, and all your internal programme communications, such as departmental intranet pages, programme handbooks, and the VLE. Students then get used to recognising that they're developing these skills and attributes alongside the knowledge elements of their programme. The next stage is how we articulate the skills and attributes through teaching and learning. The articulate stage is also innately connected to the apply stage. How is the student actually using the skills in their learning and assessment? And what's the role of reflection as an important aspect of enabling the student to become much more aware of their skills and attributes? So when we think about that articulate phase, we can also consider structural elements of our programmes, like learning outcomes. I know from my own experience as an academic, both as a musicologist and more recently designing programmes, that learning outcomes can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they offer an important opportunity to capture the essence of a program or course. But on the other hand, that can feel like splitting the atom to actually nail it down. Quality assurance is an important part of why we need learning outcomes for consistency. But what we often find is a focus on what we're going to cover in a course or program's content. From an employability point of view, that's only part of the story, as we know. So if we think about how we can rewrite learning outcomes, focusing on a richer language of transferable skills, that can really strengthen what we convey to students about what they gain from studying this course. A great example of this is a new taught postgraduate programme I worked with at King's. They had 12 terrific learning outcomes and just 2 verbs across those learning outcomes, just like these. When we thought about how the students and graduates were going to use their programme in the professionally aligned outcomes and other outcomes they might go on to, the programme team realised that they had really undersold the skills they expected students to use and develop in acquiring and applying the knowledge. So we moved towards language more like this, which was more nuanced and really suited to the focus of the programme. That spills over, of course, into how we then teach the subject. Firstly, how we teach can be shaped by those innately developed subject skills. Here are some of the skills that I use as a musicologist. They distinctively define what it is to study the subject and therefore to teach it. And when we start seeing that more explicitly, we can start to articulate to students that they're using these skills all the time in how they engage with the subject, and not just when they meet the learning outcomes through assessment. So I think there's a really important role for academics in actively signalling the presence and use of those skills as they happen in real time in teaching and learning. As an example, I mentioned that I'd recently designed a course, which was a careers and employability strategy course that I developed with a colleague. And just a few weeks ago, in a one-to-one with a student, we were talking about how the student had used the learning outcome skills of risk evaluation and some of the challenges they had in doing so. So it's not just about flagging the skills as they're used, but also about engaging students in active reflection about their use of those skills. What was easy? What was hard? Why is one skill more relevant in a particular context? How might they be using combinations or sequences of skills? And so on. The student takes responsibility for how they apply those skills and attributes when they undertake formative and summative assessment. And we know that the diversification of assessment is increasingly a priority in curriculum transformation work. What I think is interesting here across all subjects is the role that experiential learning and meaningful assessment are seen to have as a way of supporting employability development. But if we think for a moment about subjects that are not professionally aligned, across humanities for example, when we position meaningful assessment as equal to real-world assessment and practical applications, that can quickly become a barrier to diversifying assessment in some subjects. As we know, for some academics, our students are here to escape the world and not prepare for it. But I think that when we talk about the skills and attributes innately developed in a subject, and we think of meaningful assessment as also being meaningful or authentic to subject, then what we're doing is developing students' capabilities to use skills in complex ways and deepening their engagement with the subject, like these suggestions show. And those things are not just meaningful or authentic to the subject, but they can also be useful in the real world too, without affecting the integrity of the curriculum or the subject. I think it's worth saying a word or two here about experiential learning specifically, and how that connects to self-awareness of skills. We know that experiential learning often focuses on the value of industry experience and work readiness. But what are the transferable skills and attributes that make up those professional learning gains, in particular those innately developed subject-based ones? We can manage that conversation more easily if we use a skills framework or language that manages expectations and sets specific goals for progress. And we know from research published a decade ago now that when we prepare students better for any form of experiential learning by reflecting on their goals in advance, this significantly enhances the impact of that learning experience. It's also worth making a note that the person-centered approach to reflection is a somewhat Anglo-centric one, and that it doesn't effectively align with many international education cultures. I found in my own professional practice that asking students to start with what has happened and why is a more inclusive place to start with than me and I, which just doesn't make sense to many international students. Finally, there is the need to translate the transferable skills and attributes to the wider context, including employment. And this is where the role of the careers and employability professionals becomes key. Once students know what their skills and attributes are, they need to be able to recognise them in job descriptions and other contexts. We also need to do as much as we can to enable students to create that career agility and mobility for themselves by seeing those skills in roles outside the obvious aligned outcomes for their degree. As I suggested earlier on, I think this is going to become more and more important. This is, though, a good time to reflect on the nested relationships that we're looking at here. We started by thinking about employability, the transferable skills and attributes which, alongside knowledge and experience, support students to become employable in any role of their choosing, in any sector, at any level, including freelancing and entrepreneurship. When they apply for a specific opportunity, we can narrow that down and call it recruitability. How they present the required elements of employability that are needed in a specific combination for a particular role or opportunity, including voluntary positions. But as academics, we also want to think about that holistic value of curriculum. Everything we want the student to carry forward with them into their future life, for them to use in whatever way they want, to achieve the impact that they want to achieve. That is the lasting value of what we do. And when we use extracted employability and approaches like that, we make it easier for students to know what that impact is going to be and what tools they have to achieve it. So to wrap up, I'm going to put all this back into the Glasgow context. Colleagues will hopefully recognise the embedding employability framework and may be aware that the enhance phase reflects the experiential learning opportunities, and that's already been discussed and shaped via learning and teaching committees. The work I will be supporting Glasgow with is in the identity and surface phases, where we understand the employability value innate to the subject or discipline, and what's developed naturally during course and programme design, and we explain the employability value of what we teach to students by making more explicit reference to knowledge and skill acquisition. It's also worth reiterating my observation earlier that when we do this, we support students to know what assets they have to navigate the uncertain future of work. I don't believe that we can future-proof students any more than we can future-proof our curriculum. But I think we can give students all the tools they need to know what they bring to the world of work that will help them identify the right choices for them and adapt to new opportunities. Transferable skills underpin their ability to learn new knowledge and specialist skills, and that will be needed for all of us. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this webinar informative. I hope to meet you in September in Glasgow, and here are the references to my work that I noted at the start. Thank you.